I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, still reeling from the events of the past few months. It all started when my life took a drastic turn just one day before my final exams. My parents accused me of something unthinkable and kicked me out of our home. I had always believed we were a close-knit family, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. My parents were strict but loving in their own way. They had high expectations for us, always pushing me and my sister, Rachel, to be the best we could be. Rachel was the golden child, beautiful, smart, and successful. She had everything going for her, including a wonderful husband, Daniel, who seemed like the perfect match. They married young, and although they initially moved out, they eventually returned to live at our family home when Daniel got a job nearby. My parents were thrilled. They loved having them around, and in a way, so did I, despite the constant comparisons between us. I looked up to Rachel and was happy to have her close. As for me, I was still in college and my life was very much dictated by my parents. The university was nearby, and when I suggested moving into a dorm for more independence, they immediately shut it down. "Why would you waste money on a dorm when you can stay here?" they would say. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about control. They liked knowing where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing at all times. I convinced myself it was because they cared, but deep down, I knew it was suffocating. Our house was always busy, with Rachel and Daniel living with us. It felt like we were all cramped together, trying to navigate adult lives while still being treated like kids. My parents doted on Daniel, treating him almost like the son they never had. They would brag about him to anyone who would listen, and it was clear that he could do no wrong in their eyes. I, on the other hand, didn't pay much attention to Rachel's husband. Daniel had developed an ego after hearing how proud my parents were of him. He would often ask me why I wasn't staying in the dorms, even though he very well knew that it was my parents' wish. Overall, I received judgment not only from my parents, but also from Rachel and Daniel about my life choices. Meanwhile, I was working hard to balance my studies, a part-time job, and a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend, Ethan, who attended school in another state. My parents didn't think much of him. Just like I had been compared to Rachel my whole life, they now compared Ethan to Daniel. They never outright said it, but their disapproval was clear in the way they dismissed him whenever I brought him up. Despite the tension, I tried to keep the peace. I helped out around the house, cooked dinner, and did my best to stay out of Rachel and Daniel's way. Rachel and I were never particularly close, but we maintained a cordial relationship. She was busy with her own life and I was focused on my studies, so our interactions were limited to polite conversations and the occasional family dinner. Daniel, on the other hand, was always friendly, treating me more like a little sister than just his wife's sibling. We got along well, and I appreciated having someone who didn't seem to judge me the way my parents did. But everything changed one day, out of nowhere. My parents called me into the living room with serious expressions. It was just before my finals, and I was stressed out and exhausted from studying. They said they had something important to discuss, and I immediately felt a pit in my stomach. They looked at me with disappointment and anger, saying they had found some messages on my phone, messages that allegedly proved I was trying to sleep with Daniel, my sister's husband. I was completely blindsided. They showed me these so-called texts, but they were so out of context and clearly made up. I tried to explain that I would never, ever think of Daniel that way. He was like a brother to me, and besides, I had Ethan, whom I loved with all my heart. But they wouldn't listen. It was as if all the trust we had built over the years was gone in an instant. They accused me of trying to ruin Rachel's marriage and demanded that I leave the house immediately. Throughout this interaction, I begged them to let me talk to Daniel, but Daniel apparently was too shaken up by everything to have a conversation with me. With nowhere else to go, I called my grandparents, desperate and in tears. I told them everything that had happened, showing them the real messages that proved I had no interest in Daniel and that I was being falsely accused. My grandparents, who had always been kind and understanding, believed me without hesitation. They took me in, gave me a place to stay, and supported me through the worst time of my life. But my father was furious. He didn't like that I was staying with them instead of being taught a lesson. One day, when I wasn't home, he came to my grandparents' house and lashed out at them, accusing them of spoiling me and undermining his authority. My grandparents defended me, and the argument ended with my father storming out, vowing never to speak to them again. It broke my heart to see the family torn apart like this. I often felt guilty, thinking that if I hadn't gone to my grandparents, none of this would have happened. But then the unthinkable happened. My grandfather passed away suddenly. It was devastating. I had never felt such pain in my life, but what hurt even more was that my parents didn't come to his funeral. I was barely holding it together, trying to manage everything with Ethan's help, and on top of that, I had to take care of my grandmother, who was completely heartbroken. Her husband was gone, and her own son had abandoned her in her time of need. A few days later, out of nowhere, my parents showed up at my grandparents' house. I was still grieving, and seeing them only brought up all the anger and pain I had been trying to push down. I asked them why they hadn't come to the funeral, and they casually said they were out of the city. But I knew the truth: they had been on vacation. My cousin had seen their posts and told me everything, but I kept quiet, holding back the urge to confront them. At that time, Ethan was also staying with us for a few days, helping me and my grandmother cope with the loss. When he came out to see my parents, my father coldly asked me why he was there, as if Ethan's presence was a problem. That struck a nerve in me. I had been holding everything together, managing the funeral arrangements, supporting my grandmother, and dealing with my own grief, all while my parents were off enjoying themselves, ignoring their responsibilities. I felt a surge of anger rise within me as I looked at my father, who seemed completely oblivious to the hurt he had caused. I asked him who he thought had managed all the funeral arrangements, who had made sure everything was done properly, who had been there for my grandmother when she needed her family the most. Ideally, it should have been him, the son who should have taken charge, but he had been nowhere near us, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our shattered family. Dad didn't like that, but he glared at me, clearly offended that I would dare question him, and told me to watch my tone, as if I was still the obedient child he could control, but I wasn't that person anymore. Then, almost out of nowhere, his entire demeanor shifted. The anger in his eyes disappeared, replaced by an unsettling calm. He suddenly became the calmest person in the room, speaking softly and saying that he wasn't here to fight. He claimed he wanted to let everything go and start fresh. He even said he would forgive me for what had happened with Daniel, as if that was something I needed forgiveness for. He then mentioned that he would allow me to stay with my grandmother, but in return, he wanted something that was his. I was taken aback. A moment ago, he was telling me to watch my tone, and now he was talking about forgiveness and forgetting the past. It didn't make any sense. And then it hit me: he was here for the inheritance. After everything he had put Grandpa through, after the abandonment and betrayal, he was now here for money. He wasn't interested in making amends or fixing our broken relationship. He wanted what he thought was his, what he believed he was entitled to, regardless of the damage he had caused, but he had no idea that Grandpa was well aware of his motives. Grandpa, bless his soul, had taken care of everything. A day after the funeral, as we started clearing out Grandpa's room, we came across a note tucked away in one of his drawers. It simply said, "Call Bob." Bob was a lawyer and an old friend of Grandpa's, someone who had visited several times in the past. When we contacted Bob, he delivered the news that Grandpa had left behind a will, carefully deciding who would inherit what. Looking back now, Dad's timing seemed almost too perfect. It was as if he knew the will would be brought up soon and wanted to stake his claim before it did. But I have to admit, it gave me a deep sense of satisfaction when I told him that I knew exactly what he was looking for. He wasn't here to reconcile, to mend our broken family, or even to offer any real forgiveness. No, he was here for Grandpa's savings, for the money. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. The man who had once been my father, who I had hoped could see beyond his pride and ego, was nothing more than a stranger in that moment. His entire presence had been calculated, his forgiveness a mere pretense to gain access to what he felt was owed to him. I had no illusions left. As I sat there with my heart racing, I could hear Ethan's voice, quiet but steady, behind me. He had been observing the entire exchange and was clearly disturbed by the turn of events. I didn't need to look at him to know he was just as shocked as I was. He had always been there for me, even when my family had turned their backs. He had held my hand through every step of the grief process, even when I had no words to express the pain I felt. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as though time itself had frozen, and I was left in a surreal haze. My father, sensing that I was no longer the naive child he could manipulate, shifted uncomfortably. He broke the silence, his voice cold and almost pleading. "I didn't come here for this, Emma. I came here because I want to move on. I want you to move on. We are family. We need to get past all this and start fresh." I stared at him, my mind racing. Move on? How could I possibly move on when everything was broken? How could I forgive him for turning his back on his own father and then trying to exploit the aftermath of his death for his own gain? But before I could say a word, my grandmother, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You don't get to decide when we move on, Arthur. You don't get to come here, after abandoning your family, after betraying your own father, and pretend that you have any say in how we heal. Your actions have consequences, and you can't just erase them with empty words." My father froze, the mask of authority slipping for a brief moment. His lips parted, as though he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. My grandmother's words had struck a chord with him, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I had never expected. Shame. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet intensity, stood up. His voice was firm but gentle as he spoke to my father. "You can't just waltz in here and expect everything to be okay, Arthur. You've hurt Emma, you've hurt your father, and now you're trying to hurt us all over again. We're done being your punching bags. If you want to be part of this family, you need to show up in a way that earns respect. And that starts with accepting the consequences of your actions." My father's face turned red, his jaw clenched in anger. But something inside him snapped. He turned on his heel, walking out of the house without another word. For a moment, the room was silent. It was a silence filled with so many emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and even a strange sense of closure. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed with my grandmother, helping her adjust to life without Grandpa, but also realizing that I had no idea what the future held. I had been so consumed with what I had, lost my family, my home, the trust I had placed in people who didn't deserve it, that I forgot to consider what I could gain. Ethan stayed by my side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. With him, I was no longer just the girl who was betrayed by her parents. I was someone with her own strength, her own voice. It wasn't easy. I was still grieving. I was still angry. But I knew now that I didn't need to accept the narrative they had written for me. I could write my own. I went to see my parents once more, after a few weeks had passed. I had no intention of making amends. I wasn't ready for that, but I needed to look them in the eye and say the things I had kept silent for too long. When I walked into their house, they were seated in the living room. They didn't seem surprised to see me, though their faces hardened when they saw that I wasn't coming to apologize. My father opened his mouth, but I raised my hand to stop him. "You don't get to speak to me like nothing ever happened," I said, my voice steady despite the knots in my stomach. "I know what you did. I know what you wanted, and you need to understand that this—" I gestured around the room. "This isn't how family works. You don't get to come back and expect everything to be fine because you've decided it's time to forgive me. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's earned." My mother, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Emma, please, we know we made mistakes, but we were just trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I interrupted, bitter laughter escaping my lips. "By kicking me out of the house based on a lie? By choosing money over family? You don't protect people by controlling them and silencing them. You don't protect people by betraying them." There was nothing more to say. My father, who had once held so much power over me, now seemed small. His posture slumped as I spoke, and I could see the guilt in his eyes, even though he refused to admit it. "I don't want your forgiveness. I don't need it," I said, turning on my heel. "I've moved on, but I'm not coming back. Not until you can prove you've changed." And with that, I left. I left behind the toxic relationships, the years of manipulation and guilt. I left behind the family I once knew. But I also stepped into something far more important, my own future. I didn't know what lay ahead, But I knew one thing for sure. I was done being someone else's pawn. It was time for me to write my own story. As I walked out of that house and into the life I was building with Ethan, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I felt free. As the days turned into weeks, I slowly began to rebuild my life. The pain of what my family had done still lingered, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. The weight of their betrayal wasn't as heavy as it once had been. I had spent so many years trying to make them proud, trying to earn their love and acceptance. But in the end, I realized that their love had always come with conditions, and I didn't want that kind of love anymore. Ethan was there, as always, supporting me through the hardest moments. He never once wavered, never questioned my decisions. I often wondered what I had done to deserve such loyalty. But I didn't ask. I didn't have to. We found comfort in each other's company, and that was enough. I threw myself into my work and my studies, both of which had always been a constant in my life. It was strange, though. Without the constant pressure from my parents, I found that I actually enjoyed the things I used to do under duress. I was starting to discover who I was outside of their expectations. I was me, not the reflection of their hopes and dreams. For the first time, I felt like I had space to breathe. But even in this newfound freedom, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when I lay awake in the quiet of my room, I would think of my parents. I would remember the way they once looked at me with pride, the way my father's approval used to feel like the only thing that mattered. I wondered if, despite everything, I still craved their love. The thought haunted me, especially during those long, silent hours when I was alone with my thoughts. Ethan noticed the change in me. He could sense when the sadness crept in, when I would slip into moments of doubt and self-pity. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, he reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Emma," he said softly, "I know it's hard. It always is, walking away from people you thought you could trust. But you're not alone in this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The tears that threatened to fall had been long held back, and I wasn't sure if I could hold them in much longer. But I didn't want to break down, not here, not with Ethan watching. So instead I simply leaned into him, closing my eyes and letting his presence soothe the ache in my chest. "I'm not sure if I'll ever be okay with it," I whispered. "With everything that's happened. I keep thinking maybe there's a way to fix it, a way to bring my parents back into my life, but then I remember everything they did." Ethan's voice was gentle, but firm. "You don't need to fix it. Sometimes things break so completely that there's no way to put them back together. But that doesn't mean you can't build something new, something better. You've already started, Emma. You're stronger than you think." His words lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the strength I had started to rediscover in myself. Maybe I wasn't completely free of the pain my parents had caused. Maybe I would always carry some of the scars, but I wasn't alone anymore. I had Ethan, I had my grandmother, who, despite her heartbreak, still had so much love to give, and I had myself. I had my own strength, my own voice. But as much as I tried to move forward, the past had a way of creeping back in. A few months after the confrontation with my parents, I received a letter. It was from my mother. At first, I couldn't bring myself to open it. The idea of hearing from her again after everything that had happened felt like reopening an old wound. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully tore open the envelope. The letter was brief, but it carried a weight that pressed heavily on my heart. It said, "Let go of your past. I know exactly who I have to be to visit you in the future, and I hope it will be for the better of both of you." Oh, Emma, I don't know where to start or what to say. I know that nothing I say will fix the hurt we've caused you, or make up for the things we've done. But I need you to know that I never wanted things to be this way. I've always been proud of you, even if I never showed it in the right way. Your father and I are not perfect, and I've realized that I've been holding on to things, grudges, pride, whatever it is, that kept us from seeing what really matters. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the lies, the hurt, the things I should have said, but didn't. If you ever find it in your heart to forgive me, I will be here. Always. Love. I sat there, staring at the letter, my mind swirling. Part of me wanted to rip it up and pretend it had never existed. How could she ask for forgiveness after everything that had happened, after the way they had kicked me out, after the way they had treated me as if I was the problem? It felt too soon, too simple. But another part of me, a part that I wasn't sure was ready to let go of the past, wondered if there was a way forward. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. I didn't have the answers yet. I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive her, but I realized as I set the letter aside that it wasn't my responsibility to fix everything. I had already done the hardest part. I had chosen myself, and that, I realized, was enough for now. The next few months passed in a bittersweet haze. I continued to build my life with Ethan, growing more in love with him every day. But there was always a shadow in the background, a longing for the family I had lost. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, whether my parents and I would ever be able to rebuild our relationship, or if I would have to walk away for good. But one thing was certain, I had found my own path. It wasn't the path I had once imagined, full of family gatherings and quiet Sunday afternoons. It wasn't the fairy tale I had dreamed of when I was younger. But it was mine, and it was real, and maybe that was enough. Months passed, and life, though quieter and more peaceful, still had its challenges. I was learning to live with the hole my parents had left in my heart, even as I tried to fill it with other things. School, work, and the love Ethan showed me every day. But the more I distanced myself from the past, the more I realized just how much it had shaped me, the trauma I'd endured, the lies I'd been told, and the betrayal from the people I had once trusted more than anyone. Those things didn't disappear. They festered beneath the surface, and no matter how much I tried to bury them, they always had a way of resurfacing when I least expected it. And then, one evening, the phone rang. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't a wrong number. I answered hesitantly. "Emma?" A voice, shaky but familiar, spoke from the other end. "It's Lisa." I froze, the weight of her name sending a surge of emotions flooding through me. I hadn't spoken to her since the day my life had been shattered by those accusations, and even then our conversations had been superficial. Polite exchanges at family gatherings. My sister and I had never been close. But now, everything felt different. I felt like I didn't even know her anymore. "Lisa," I said, my voice soft. "What is it?" "I need to talk to you. It's about Brad." The mention of his name made my stomach churn. Brad, the man I had once seen as a brother, the man who had destroyed my life with his lies, the man who had shattered our family by using my name as a weapon. The thought of him still brought a wave of disgust. But Lisa's voice trembled, and I could hear the pain in her words. "Lisa, I didn't know what to do. I found out the truth. I just didn't know who to turn to." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "What are you talking about?" "I know what Brad did. I know how he set you up. He saved his assistant's number as yours, Emma. He framed you. He betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I was too blind to see it." Her voice broke, and I could hear her fighting back tears. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I never believed you. I never should have." The weight of her words hit me like a slap in the face. All these years, I had carried the burden of being accused, of being thrown out of my own home, while Brad had gotten away with his lies. And now, here was Lisa, my sister, the one I had always looked up to, the one who had stood by him asking for forgiveness. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to scream at her for being so blind, for betraying me when I had needed her the most. But another part of me, an aching, broken part, just wanted to be held, to have someone tell me that everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't going to be okay. It had never been okay. "Lisa," I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper, "I don't know if I can forgive you. After everything that happened, I don't know if I can trust you again." Her sobs came through the phone, raw and full of regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know the truth, Emma. You didn't deserve any of this. Brad was the one who destroyed our family. I was too selfish to see it." I closed my eyes, the tears I had been holding back threatening to break free. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it wasn't too late to fix things. But part of me also wanted to keep running, to keep the distance that had protected me for so long. "I don't know what to do with this, Lisa," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if we can fix this." "I don't know either," she replied softly. "But I'm here, Emma. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry." Her words hung in the air like an unfinished prayer, and for a moment I felt torn between two worlds. The world where my family still loved me, even if it was complicated and full of mistakes, and the world where they had left me behind, never once looking back to see the damage they had caused. "I need time, Lisa. I need time to think." And with that, we ended the call. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to go to her, to hug her, to tell her that I had always loved her despite everything, but the other part of me, the part that had suffered through so much, knew that the wounds ran deep. Deeper than she could ever understand. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance. I didn't reach out to Lisa, and she didn't reach out to me again. I continued with my life, trying to heal. Ethan was there, always by my side, a steady presence that gave me the strength to face each new day. But even his support couldn't erase the sense of loss that haunted me. One day, while I was sitting in the living room, I received another call. This time it was from Grandma. "Emma," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. I need to tell you something." I sat up straight, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it, Grandma?" "I just spoke with Lisa. She told me she and Brad are getting a divorce. She's leaving him." My heart stopped. I couldn't comprehend what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, after everything Brad had done to destroy our family, Lisa was finally leaving him. But it was too little, too late. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "I never wanted this for her, but I don't know if I can help her now." "You don't have to help her, Emma," Grandma said softly. "You've already done enough. It's not your job to fix everything." But I didn't know if I could move forward without the answers, without understanding why my family had done what they had, why Lisa had stood by Brad knowing all along that he had framed me, why my parents had let me go so easily, so heartlessly. In the end, I realized something that I had been avoiding all along. The people I'd loved, the people I had thought I could trust, had made their choices, and I had to make mine. I had chosen to walk away. I had chosen to protect myself, and in doing so, I had created a new life, one where I could grieve again. But that didn't mean I didn't grieve. It didn't mean I didn't feel the sting of their betrayal, their absence, every single day. And as I lay in bed that night, tears streaming down my face, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to move on, the past would always be there, just out of reach, a shadow, a memory that would haunt me forever. And in the end, I would have to learn to live with it. As time went on, I continued to navigate the uneasy balance between the life I had rebuilt and the ghosts of the past that lingered just out of sight. I had learned to accept that healing wasn't linear and that some days were better than others. Ethan's love, steady and unshakable, gave me a foundation I never thought I'd have again. But there were moments when I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was still missing. The tension between my past and present was never more apparent than when I received a letter one afternoon. It was a letter from my mother, a letter written in her familiar handwriting, but with a distance that made it feel foreign. The words she wrote were a mixture of regret and explanations, apologies, but not truly apologies. She claimed to have misunderstood everything, and admitted that Brad had deceived her, just as much as he had deceived Lisa and me, but that wasn't what hit me the hardest. What shook me to my core was what she said at the end. "I've realized too late that I pushed you away, that I should have been there for you. You were my child and I failed you. I know you might never forgive me, but I need you to know that I love you, and I've always loved you." The letter was a sharp slap of truth, a reminder of the love that was supposed to bind us, and how quickly that love could be twisted by lies. I stared at the paper for hours, unable to process it fully. I couldn't decide if it was an attempt to make amends or just another way for her to ease her own guilt. I folded the letter carefully, unsure whether I would ever be able to forgive her, let alone rebuild the bond we once shared. But I also couldn't ignore the small part of me that wanted to believe her, the daughter inside me, the one who had longed for my mother's love and approval, still wanted to believe that things could be different. It wasn't until later that week, after a quiet conversation with Ethan, that I realized the truth. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt didn't exist. It was about making the decision, for myself, to let go of the anger and pain that had kept me bound to that chapter of my life. It didn't mean reconciling with my mother or fixing the brokenness between us. It meant freeing myself from it. It meant taking control of my future, not letting the scars from the past define who I was. That night, as I lay beside Ethan, his arm wrapped around me, I made a choice. I wasn't going to carry their mistakes anymore. I wasn't going to hold on to the lies and betrayals. I was going to move forward. But forgiveness was still a work in progress. It wasn't something I could force or rush, but rather something I would have to choose again and again. And as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, the truth was, I had to acknowledge it in order to heal. The scars would always be there, but they didn't have to control me. A few weeks later, Lisa reached out to me again. This time, she didn't call. She sent a message, a simple text that read, "Emma, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope one day we can rebuild what we lost. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry and that I love you." Her words hit me hard, stirring up emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I wasn't sure what to do with them yet, but I knew that there was still a part of me that longed for the sister I had once known. But the pain of our broken bond was not something I could ignore. I was still finding my way, still navigating the murky waters of what forgiveness truly meant. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, I thought back to all the years I had spent fighting for answers, for truth, and for justice. I realized that, in the end, the greatest thing I could do for myself was not to chase after the people who had hurt me, but to give myself permission to heal, to move forward, and to create a new future. That night, I made a decision. I would take things one day at a time, allowing myself the space to feel whatever I needed to feel without the pressure to rush the healing process. I would embrace the love I had in my life, the people who had stayed by my side through everything, and I would be kind to myself as I navigated the complexities of my own heart. As for my mother, I didn't know what the future held. Maybe one day we could find a way to rebuild our relationship. But that wasn't something I could force. It would come, if it was meant to. And as for Lisa, I couldn't say what the future would hold for us either. But I knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing to not let the past control my future. Whether or not she would ever be a part of that future, I didn't know. But I wasn't going to wait for anyone to decide that for me. The journey wasn't easy. It never would be. But I was learning to live with the weight of the past, to face it head on, and to choose, every day, the kind of person I wanted to become. And as the days passed, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, steady peace. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would, but I had the strength to keep moving forward. And for now, that was enough.